to call this midnight, after midnight with Colin Grabow, but considering most of our audience is here in Puerto Rico, I think Power Hour is still a more appropriate name. Um, we have a couple of housekeeping items that we'll get to. Colin, I know that we have a full conversation slated with you. Typically, we start about 5 minutes after the hour, and then we'll jump in. A couple of people will join throughout the hour, but we're recording, and this is part of our regular scheduled monthly programming. This is Power Hour, our most informal of our three segments. But that doesn't mean that it's less interesting or less important by any means. And we're going to get into something that I think is critically important, not just for Puerto Rico, but on the U.S. National level. Probably should garner a lot more interest and attention than it is. And Colin, we're glad to have you as an advocate for what Tom and I certainly think is a critically important conversation. So before we get into that, this is one of three segments, as I mentioned. The other segment takes place next Thursday, and that is Puerto Rico Energy in 60 Minutes. And it's our monthly topical conversation where we review the month of news over the last 30 or so days in energy in Puerto Rico. Next week, we are hosting Angel Sayas, Dr. Power from AZ Engineering. And then not next Tuesday, but the Tuesday following that, the last Tuesday of the month, we have CP Smith for our regular televised therapy session. CP, good to see you on the line with us today, but that's going to be a good one as well in the lead up to the political changes, both on the island as well as on the national level. We'll be talking about reflections on policy recommendations for the next government. And then going into November, we'll reflect on some of the changes that will become more apparent and speak with some experts on the policy regimes of particularly as it comes to energy, of the winning parties and what those implications are for Puerto Rico and beyond. So stay tuned. We're glad you're here. If you're not a member, the fact that you all are here means you are members, and so we appreciate you being here and appreciate that support. Tell your friends. Feel free to upgrade to corporate membership. If not, feel free to support us individually. We appreciate that. This is the Puerto Rico Energy Forum, and as a nonprofit organization, we couldn't do this without your support. So that is, I think, the highest level housekeeping. One other note is that if you have an AI note taker, no need to invite it to the meeting. We are recording, and you will get access to the recording afterwards. So I know that some folks have that just automatically invited, and if you don't see it in the participant list, it's because we've decided this is humans only, a humans only activity. We have a couple of other activities. Tom, you're on mute.
Thanks. Plus, we record and provide these to members anyway. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
You will all get access to this recording in about a week. And we also are uploading old episodes on our YouTube channel. You can find those through the Fundación Borencana, or follow us on LinkedIn or other social media and get access to the content that we're producing. We have a couple of new activities going on at the end of this month that will continue through, as really as long as necessary. We talked about this when we first got started with the Puerto Rico Energy Forum, and we reiterated it again at the Puerto Rico Energy Forum live event, National Clean Energy Week, last week of September, that we want to complement our regular segments with specific issue working groups. What we are doing at the high level in the forum is touching base on, considering we have 12 general forums a year, really 12 plus general themes when it comes to energy. We could spend a lot of time on each one of those themes, and that's really the purpose behind the working groups. And so we're starting with the circular economy regarding solar panels, end of life management of solar panels, and how do we make sure from a policy to manufacturing to implementation perspective, those are thought out and delivered in whether it's a policy brief or an advocacy type committee. That'll be up to the group that leads that conversation. So one is the circular economy of solar panels, and the other is microgrid development here in Puerto Rico. During National Clean Energy Week, that was one of our key panels, and Tom has written a concise op-ed with regards to the vacuum in Puerto Rico with regards to microgrid development. It's something that something of a bugaboo for um, the forum, for Tom, for a number of people, including the company that I work for, with regards to developing distributed energy solutions in Puerto Rico and recognizing the impact that those can have, and recognizing that as of right now in Puerto Rico, we have a very mature distributed market and a very mature, but a lot of activity on the utility scale. This intermediary level requires a lot of support and TLC. And so those two working groups are getting started this month. As members, you get easy, direct access to them. If you want to participate in either of those or both of those, let us know. Otherwise, you'll likely have seen invitations from Tom. We also have a members meeting before our Puerto Rico Energy in 60 Minutes meeting next week. It's just 30 minutes before the 6 o'clock start of Power Hour. Join us. We want to hear your thoughts. This is a forum, and forums are designed to host an interchange of ideas. And so we want to know what it is that you'd like to talk about. What are the priorities for you, and your perspective on what we're discussing. So. Tom, other housekeeping notes that I may have left out?
I mean, I think you covered pretty much most of them. I would just say we have like 11, I think, monthly. We could have skipped Christmas. We could invite everybody and have a tree and do something virtual, but I think people want to do other things during the Christmas period. But other than that, minor technical point. Short meetings this month of the microgrid working group and the circular economy working group. We're gonna take temperatures and direction and organize and have the groups themselves decide how often they meet, when they're going to be providing reports out, et cetera, what the goals are going to be. We're we're happy to lead and put ideals in people's heads, but the actual answers we want to make sure is more crowd funded and participatory rather than top down. Yeah.
Yeah, and let me just say, we had panels during our National Clean Energy Week on not just microgrid development, but nuclear alternatives for Puerto Rico and natural gas. Those I think are ready made for additional working groups. Angel, if you're interested in taking the lead on nuclear working group, would love to have nuclear alternative projects be there at the front of that. Same with the nexus between telecom and energy, and so Gail, if the 5G zone is interested in leading one of those conversations, by all means. We want this to be participatory, and we
Yeah.
want to make sure that we're really embracing a broad set of approaches to understanding energy. All too often energy is sort of misunderstood as a single thing, and that's certainly not the case. One of the things, perhaps that's the best place to get started. So
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
that note, sorry, go ahead, Gail.
No, and so I was going to say it would be great to maybe even talk about the proposal with University of South Carolina that was regarding climate impacts, and really what is happening in Helene right now, and how similar that is to the circumstance in Puerto Rico, and how there could be findings in Puerto Rico that'd be very applicable to the Appalachian region. And
For
so that
sure.
might
I think
be a good topic.
Yeah.
no, I think absolutely, and on the same note, the rollout of federal dollars, federal recovery efforts, all of those are additional conversations that we're having, not just on the regular segments, but I think are well fitted for some of the working group sidebar conversations that we have
Right,
planned
because
for
it's
the
not just
future.
about Puerto Rico, it's that Puerto Rico is leading so many other has the potential to lead so many other areas.
Absolutely. So I think on that note, we'll jump into our conversation. The main conversation that we're looking forward to having today with Colin Grabow. Colin is an associate director for the Herbert Stifel Center for Trade Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, um, and is a dogged researcher when it comes to the Jones Act, its economic impacts, and particularly its impact on Puerto Rico. So, Colin, welcome. Thanks for being
Thanks for
here.
having me, Sam.
One of the things that I hadn't realized is that Herbert Stifel lived quite a bit of his life in Puerto Rico, um, and was the CEO of a pharmaceutical company. Ended up being bought out by GlaxoSmithKline. Um, what I couldn't find is what he thought about the Jones Act. Do you, to your knowledge, did he have an opinion on it?
Well, given his support for free trade and libertarian causes, I would assume, I don't know, never had a conversation, don't know anybody who did, but I would assume as a right-thinking person, he would be firmly opposed to the Jones Act.
Yeah, interesting. He was also a businessman and depended heavily on the logistics industry to get raw materials and finished products off the island. I don't know enough about what trade in the 60s exactly looked like from a logistics perspective, but I'm guessing all of that was on a boat.
I would think so, and I can just tell you, I know for a fact that opposition, or at least a recognition of the Jones Act's cost to Puerto Rico are longstanding. This isn't something that started in the last few years. It goes back decades. It goes back, you can find literature back from the 60s. And even, I mean, literally since the time that Puerto Rico became part of the United States and was subject to U.S. laws, U.S. Shipping laws, you can find people complaining about this and recognizing the high cost that came with that.
So that's probably the best place to start. You know, I've sort of organized my idea of this conversation in a couple of different areas. The history of the Jones Act, history of shipping as it pertains to Puerto Rico, some of the theoretical challenges to and of the Jones Act, some of the practical challenges, and sort of ending with where do we go from here. Yeah, by all means, if there's other points that you'd like to bring up that we don't ask about. You're the expert on the matter. The Jones Act was codified in 1920. What was the nature of U.S. shipping or in global shipping in 1920?
Yeah, so the Jones Act is Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. Some people may hear that and think, okay, 1920, so pre-1920, it was open season, you could use whatever, kind of vessel you wanted, and that's not true. The Jones Act was basically just the latest iteration of cabotage laws that go back basically to the founding of the country. I mean, one of the first acts of Congress. It didn't ban foreign shipping from transporting goods within the U.S., but it basically put a prohibitive tariff to such an extent it made no economic sense to use them. That was like the third act of Congress, something like that. That had discriminatory duties. But then in 1817, Congress just flat out banned foreign shipping. So people might hear that and think that, well, okay, the founding of the country, you're telling me the founding fathers were in favor of this and you're against it. What gives? I think what we need to keep in mind here is that the context is entirely different between 2024 and the late 1700s, early 1800s. So back then, the United States was one of the world's best shipbuilders. Something like, for context, something like 1/3 of all the ships in the British merchant fleet were built in the United States. This makes sense when you think about it, because this is the days of wooden ships, sail ships. And US had lots of raw materials, basically the whole East Coast, the 13 original states were all heavily forested, easy access to the water. You had the human capital, people that knew how to build vessels. So that's how it started out. And in fact, some historians have said that basically these early measures that restricted foreign shipping were almost cost, or if not cost free, because there was really no advantage to using a foreign ship anyway, because US shipping and shipbuilding was some of the world's most competitive. Also, there's a rationale for restricting foreign vessels from national security perspective, you want as many American flag vessels as possible because in time of war, you could repurpose those, load some cannon on them, use them as privateers, go hunt enemy shipping. Basically, you have a naval militia. And of course, our biggest rivals back then was the British Navy. So having a big naval presence, that was no small consideration. But that's not the world we live in today. And that's not even the world we lived in, like, 50, 60 years on. By the time we got to the mid 1800s, certainly by the Civil War, that had changed. We went from the era of wooden ships to ships made of iron, steel, steam powered, and the US fell behind. And what was once one of the world's most competitive shipbuilders became one of the world's least. US shipbuilding stopped being international competitive around the 1860s. So people started looking for ways around the shipping laws. And one thing they hit on was, okay, well, I can't use a foreign ship from one US port to another, but what if I use a foreign ship to a foreign port and then from that foreign port back to a US port? And in fact, someone tried that and sent 250 kegs of nails from the East Coast to California, and they did it through Belgium. They sent a foreign ship to Antwerp, then transferred to another ship and sent it to Southern California. And what's interesting is they obviously did the math, and that made more sense than using a U.S. ship more directly. There was a court case about this. The court ruled no, said yes, actually that is permissible. So Congress changed the law and said, okay, no more. If it starts in the U.S. and a U.S. port, finishes in a U.S. port, has to be an American ship. But then there was one other workaround people found, and that was through Alaska. People were shipping goods to and from Alaska through the port of Vancouver. And instead of taking things on a ship up to the port of Vancouver, they take it over land to Vancouver. So they said, oh, we're not taking a foreign ship to Vancouver, just going over land to Vancouver. And that was deemed permissible. So Seattle-based shipping interests, they hated this. They said, no, this is unfair foreign competition. This should all be going through the port of Seattle. So World War I comes along. The US doesn't have enough ships, doesn't have enough shipbuilding to get all the men and supplies. This is before, commercial airlines, everything had to go by ship to France. And so the US starts building lots of ships to make up for that, built, hundreds of them. The war ends. What are we going to do with all these ships we just built? The government has no purpose to hold them. So people want to get those back into private hands. So there was a decision, let's have this Merchant Marine Act and we'll deal with the disposal of those ships and we'll take care of a bunch of other things too. So the Merchant Marine Act in 1920 had 30 some sections. Section 27 dealt with cabotage. So people in Senator Wesley Jones, he was the guy running the committee putting this bill together. He's from Washington State. He had a house in Seattle. And guys from the Pacific Steamship Company based in Seattle, they testified before Congress in February 1920. They say, look, we got this problem with the unfair competition. We think you should change the law so you can eliminate this. And by the way, we have some language right for you. We think we know exactly what would fix this. And if you look at Section 27, what we today call the Jones Act, it's like 90% the same as what was proposed by the guys at the Seattle Steamship Company. That's how we got the Jones Act. That's how it came to be. And just the last point here. And so the Jones Act was passed in June of 1920. In August of 1920, Senator Jones goes back to Tacoma, Washington. He meets with a bunch of folks to defend this bill, talk about it. Sitting right next to him is a representative from the Pacific Steamship Company, the same guy that testified before Congress, the same guy that proposed what we today call the Jones Act. So that's how it came to be. And to answer your question more directly, the situation was not good, as evidenced by the fact that during the war, we did not have the ships, we did not have the shipbuilding, and we had to do this crash program to build all those ships.
So, one of the there's obviously a protectionist element to it, but another one is the national security element and going into the merchant marine basis of a lot of the argumentation behind and still the defense of a lot of the defenders of the Jones Act rely on. The merchant marines has since the U.S. founding been a pretty critically important fleet. Anybody who's famously in Dunkirk, though it's not U.S. merchant marine, the civilian boats, but in the Civil War, it had a role. In World War II, obviously, it had a role. In Vietnam, it had a role. The Gulf Wars, it had a role. In fact, I was in just researching for our conversation, the most important civilian vessel in the Vietnam War was the SS Mayaguez, and in the Gulf War was the SS Ponce. And so these are U.S. or Puerto Rico serving and Puerto Rico based ships, which was a coincidence I didn't expect to find. Why is the Merchant Marine not a relevant defense of the Jones Act?
Yeah, so if I was a Jones Act supporter, what I suspect, a Jones Act supporter would tell you is that the Jones Act is critical. The reason we need to maintain it is because theoretically, it provides ships that have utility in times of war that can transport the goods, the materials, the supplies for our military to where they're needed. It provides through that U.S. flag requirement. It also has U.S. crew requirements. We know the guys on those ships are going to be Americans. That makes them more trustworthy. That's an asset that you want in terms of national security. The U.S. build requirement also means that, hey, we're generating business for U.S. shipyards. Shipyards can build ships in time of war. They can repair ships in time of war. That's important too. So this is why it's critical to maintain this law. So my response to that is that I think that would be a good argument if that's actually what the law provided. If we had a robust, competitive shiplet industry, that would be interesting. If we had a large fleet, that would be interesting. But the Jones Act, if you compare the theory to the reality, I think it falls apart. So in terms of shipbuilding, the U.S. last year, all U.S. shipyards combined, their output accounted for 0.1% of global output. It's not 1%, it's 0.1%. Top 15 countries, United States number 15. I mean, we're behind, last year, I think we were behind like Croatia, Norway, Netherlands, Finland, much smaller countries. If you look in terms of the number of ships that comply with the Jones Act, well, back in the 1950s, we had over 400. Today, we're down to 92. If you look at the number of mariners, the US government did a study back in 2017. How many mariners will we need in a sustained sea lift operation versus how many do we have? And they said in a best case scenario, you're looking at a deficit of 1,800. So my answer is let's get rid of the Jones Act. Let's do things that actually work. I fully recognize the need to meet our military sea lift requirements. I just think it's an incredibly ineffective and failed means of going about it. Part of the reason is U.S. shipbuilding. A U.S. built ship is around 4 to 5 times more expensive than one built abroad. Trying to promote a fleet by forcing everyone to pay 5 times the world price for new ships is a crazy way of going about trying to promote the use of shipping and ensuring you have a big fleet. And then also when you're charging 5 times the world price, there's not a whole lot of demand for it. So you're not building many ships. So it fails on both ends. And the last thing I'll say is that it even gets weirder than that. So a lot of the talk you hear is we need to stand up to China. The Jones Act is critical to meeting the challenge posed by China. What happens when ships cost 5 times the world price? So literally this week, the CEO of a Jones Act shipping company said he thinks the cost of a new tanker is $250 million versus 45 to 50 million abroad, just put them more concrete, less abstract terms. You get a fleet of old ships because people want to use them as long as possible, delay modernizing, replenishing your fleet as long as possible, given those costs. So to keep these old ships running, you need a lot more maintenance. Well, the way these guys solve that, take a lot of their ships over to state-owned shipyards in China and have the Chinese do the work to keep these ships running. And then they use the money they save to lobby for the Jones Act, tell us how we need it to stand up to China. Sorry, it's a long-winded response to a short question, but that's how I see it.
Spot on.
Yeah, I mean the hypocrisy is pretty pretty apparent when it comes to the workarounds, and that's what I think leads into the next area of conversation I want to have, which is the theoretical challenges of this. One of the things that often we see with regulations and policies, particularly bad regulations and poorly thought out policies, is what you might broadly call unintended consequences, but more in a slanger way, people are looking for loopholes, right? And they're looking for ways to get around regulations that don't make much sense and don't make any business. They don't facilitate any business advance, right?
Yeah.
So if I think just from macroeconomics 101, you have policy that restricts your supply, and that has the pretty predictable effect of increasing the cost of doing business throughout the entire supply chain. What are the other challenges with the Jones Act? I mean, obviously, you said that the purposes behind its creation are not being lived up to, right? Um, but let's and you talked a number about the theoretical challenge, but like how do those manifest? How do those actually
Yes, right, right.
show up
So
in
what is the effect of making shipping extremely costly? And just to give people an idea of how costly we're talking here. So as I mentioned, the cost of the ship itself, 4 to 5 times higher. You're talking again, a new tanker, that's an extra $200 million in capital costs right there. Then on top of that, you have the operating costs, paying the crew, the insurance, the fuel, things like that. US flagships are about 3 times more costly just to operate. And then Jones Act ships have the capital costs on top of that. And since we're here to talk about energy, there was a 2017 Financial Times article in which the CEO of a Jones Act shipping company, he admitted that a Jones Act ship is about a tanker is about 3 to 4 times more expensive in terms of chartering one than an internationally flagged one. So what does that do? Well, when you have really expensive shipping, basically it serves on a tax on domestic commerce. So using Puerto Rico. In 2013, the GAO did a study about the Jones Act's impact on Puerto Rico. And they talked to members of the Puerto Rican Farm Bureau, and they said, look, when it comes to things like buying animal feed, corn, potatoes, we buy those from, if you look at the US cost and the foreign cost, they're usually pretty similar. But after you factor in the cost of transportation, it makes no sense to buy American. So we import that stuff. In fact, you have to listen to the Farm Bureau. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, in one of their reports, mentioned Puerto Rico buying a lot of Chinese rice. And it said there were two reasons for that. The Chinese were selling it at a cut rate, and then it mentioned the Jones Act, that it's cheaper to ship it in from China than it is from the Southeast United States. You put, the energy example. So that same 2017 Financial Times article I mentioned, it was about how refineries on the East Coast were buying most of their energy from Africa and places like that rather than the Gulf Coast, even though the Gulf Coast has a geographic advantage. Again, after you factor in the cost of transportation, it doesn't make sense to buy American. So it imposes all kinds of distortions in I give other examples, forestry products. So the Pacific Northwest, people up there have complained about the Jones Act because, they compete with Canada. And the Canadians, it's easier for them to sell into the US market than for the actual Americans because the Canadians, they have access to efficient international shipping. Americans are under the Jones Act, and it makes it more difficult for them. So, I could spend all day giving you examples like this, but I think you get the picture. Basically, it distorts domestic commerce. The US is a big country. Having access to efficient ocean transport is really important. We don't have that. So it basically puts the thumb on the scale for buying foreign products instead of American. And then the most egregious thing is when it comes to liquefied natural gas, it's not more costly to buy American. It's just flat out impossible because the vessels to transport it don't exist. There are 0 gas carriers in the Jones Act fleet. So Puerto Rico's bulk imports of LNG, which is like, I think natural gas is 1/3-ish of Puerto Rico's electricity generation. It's all foreign because there are no ships to transport. We're the world's leading export of LNG. We can't send it to Puerto Rico because of this law.
So we're going to get into some of those examples here in a second. Before we dive fully in, why is Puerto Rico treated differently from other territories with regard to the Jones Act? Is that just because of the proximity and the diversified nature of the imports and exports on the island, or is there a deeper understanding of why Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands are treated differently than Puerto Rico?
Yeah, it's kind of a historical accident, from what I can tell. So the places that are exempted from the Jones Act, so the U.S. Virgin Islands, right next door to Puerto Rico, spitting distance, American Samoa, the Northern Mariana Islands, and then Guam. nominally has an exemption from the U.S. build requirement of the Jones Act. On a de facto basis, Guam is pretty much subject to the Jones Act because any ship going out to Guam from the U.S. mainland, they're going to hit Hawaii on the way there. It makes no sense to bypass Hawaii, which is a much larger market than Guam. So all the ships that hit Guam are all Jones Act ships coming. They hit Hawaii first, and they head on to Guam. So basically, there is one workaround that there are some U.S. flagged foreign built ships that go to Japan first and then to Guam. But since that's such a long distance, you lose some of the advantage of using the foreign built ships. Anyway, with regard to American Samoa, they are exempt due to a treaty that was signed. I think the U.S. signed a treaty with Great Britain and one other country, basically like how we're going to treat these countries. And Great Britain found out the U.S. was applying the Jones Act and said, no, this is a treaty violation. What we agreed, you can't apply cabotage laws. And the U.S. said, okay. Northern Mariana Islands, there was some agreement reached with them when they became a territory. I can't remember the full background there. And then the Virgin Islands is an interesting example. So of course they were purchased from Denmark in what, 1916, something like that. And then in the Jones Act, it said that basically the Jones Act will not be applied to the Virgin Islands. Um, um, every year, the president will evaluate if there's sufficient shipping, and if there is, then he'll apply it. And the Virgin Islands, they hated this. And they said, look, we got this hanging over us every year. We don't know if the next year we're going to have the Jones Act apply to us or not. And there were studies carried out, and they said, you're going to kill our economy if you do this to us. Because at the time, one big industry in the Virgin Islands was bunkering. Basically, they would provide coal to back in the days, the ships used coal, and they would sell coal. And the coal came out of Virginia. So they would ship it down to Virginia and then sell it. And they said, look, we're under the Jones Act and we have expensive American shipping taking that West Virginia coal, and we're going to have to raise our prices and we're going to lose business to other islands offering the service. And this is like the only game in town. We're a small island. So then in 1936, the US basically said, okay, you guys are exempt until we see otherwise. And then, like I said, Puerto Rico, my understanding is the U.S. conquered Puerto Rico in 1898, and within like 6 months, U.S. cabotage laws were applied to Puerto Rico. And of course, Puerto Rico, out of all the non-contiguous states and territories, has the biggest population. So it's kind of, it's a juicy market, and I suspect that factors into why it continues to be applied to the island.
Yeah, that sounds right. All right, getting into specifically Puerto Rico and getting into energy, why shouldn't Puerto Rico buy Trinidadian LNG?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what's interesting, so you look at a map, you would think, okay, just given proximity, sourcing from Trinidad and Tobago makes the most sense. Why are we even talking about American LNG? But I think that argument falls apart when you look at, okay, so what are other places doing that are not subject to the Jones Act? Well, right next door to Puerto Rico, of course, is the Dominican Republic. They also use LNG. And guess what? They buy a huge percentage of it from the US, which to me suggests that's the best deal in town. And it's not just there. Brazil is obviously closer than to Trinidad than it is to US export terminals. Most years it buys more American LNG than it does from Trinidad. I think Colombia also imports, small quantities, and they buy it more from the U.S. than they do from Trinidad, which suggests to me that the U.S. price and the contracts, if you want to sign a long-term contract or maybe even the spot price, that is the most economically advantageous place to purchase you from. This as evidenced by the folks that are not subject to the Jones Act. They have similar geographic proximity to Trinidad and the choices that they make.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I
and
mean, as a result, I mean, Puerto Rico is not buying the like lowest carbon natural gas they can. I mean, amongst the U.S. production of natural gas has a much lower carbon footprint than the producers virtually everywhere else in the world. I mean, to the extent of claims made in the Gulf of being like 40 to 50% less carbon intensive than the average worldwide. I mean, I haven't looked at the details of the studies, but they're good enough for the companies and representatives, et cetera, to represent that. So it's significant.
well, and some of the things that we've
Yeah.
seen just in the last couple of years is that, Colin, you cited about 30% of the island's generation comes from natural gas. But on the distributed level, the industrial microgrids that rely on natural gas for their primary power production, they had a significant issue in their cogeneration plants with importing natural gas from places like Nigeria that had um, far more contaminants in the natural gas
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
U.S. produced LNG. And so that has not just the cost, but the quality and then the maintenance costs and the operational issues with just being able to continuously run factories that are, for the most part, 24/7 and three shift facilities here in Puerto Rico. The costs throughout the entire chain go up. So this goes back a little bit to the theoretical element here. Is it so? It sounds like there's really practical issues afoot. But again, if you just open up the amount of suppliers, competition supposedly will work its way so that they can have the options, right? And if the fleets in the or the option to import it from the Gulf become less competitive, Trinidad is still on the table, Jamaica is still on the table, Oman is still on the table, right? There's other options. Opening up the market to U.S. based products doesn't mean that the foreign based products go away. It's that they're forced to compete in a different way.
100%. I think you bring up an excellent point, because that's another thing. If you take the U.S. off the table, what kind of deal is Puerto Rico getting from Trinidad when they go to the negotiating table? And the Trinidadians know that the
Yeah.
U.S. is not an option for them. I point out that. I point out that, remember, it's not just Gulf Coast export terminals anymore. They also have the one at Elba Island down near Savannah. I mean, the difference in proximity is like an additional day's sailing. This is not massive, between it and Trinidad. And the last thing I'll point out is I think in 2020, PREPA signed a contract with I can't remember the name of the company that they signed a contract with, but built into the contract was a provision that says that the price will go down by a certain amount if the Jones Act is no longer applied to natural gas shipments. So,
Yeah,
I
that
mean,
was
we
the
know for a
Newport
fact it would
Energy.
be cheaper. We don't have to even theorize about this stuff.
Yeah, that was with New Fortress Energy,
Yes.
which is still the key supplier, and in fact, their subsidiary is running the generation fleets, and so you have the opportunity to vertically integrate, some of the some of the supply chain there. But Ali, I see that your hands up. We're going to get to you just at the sort of maybe 10-15 minutes from now. When we
Yeah.
when we close out the conversation, we'll open it up to everybody who's on the call and be able to have a more back and forth. Um, Colin, you have a counterpart that I'm sure you're familiar with in John McCown at Medium, who publishes there, very much in favor of. I don't know if in favor of the Jones Act, but in contrast to what you and your colleagues at Cato were publishing, we haven't talked to John. He's not on the line. He doesn't have an opportunity to defend himself, but he is an Alabama fan, and so he clearly has some positions that are indefensible anyway. Um, it seems like his key argument is that you guys are overstating the costs. That not that he's not saying the costs aren't real, but that you're overstating the costs.
Hmm.
Shipping, a shift from foreign shipping to domestic shipping wouldn't represent a 50% decrease, but a 17% decrease in costs. What do you say to that kind of argumentation that isn't saying you're entirely wrong, but you're wrong?
Right. So a few things. Well, when it comes to energy, like I said before, with regard to, bulk shipments like tankers, again, don't take my word for this stuff. Just listen to the CEO of a Jones Act shipping company who flat out admitted that, Jones Act ships are 3 to 4 times more expensive than ones from the international fleet. And that same article, the very next sentence says, and some shipping consultants say it's higher. So I think that's instructive. McCown also discounts he says that the differential in capital costs is more like 3x. Well, again, literally this week we had CEO of a shipping company say it's a $200 million difference. It's a 5x difference. And there's other things. I think my understanding is a lot of McCown's analysis basically assumes that all that changes is everything stays the same except for you swap out the U.S. flag and the U.S. build. but it's more complicated than that. Without the Jones Act, what I suspect you'd also find is, let's look at the Virgin Islands, which is not subject to the Jones Act, and container shipping that goes there. Well, those container ships, when it comes to Jones Act routes, basically goes Jacksonville, San Juan, back and forth, a shuttle route. Well, when it comes to the Virgin Islands, they have tropical shipping serves them, and they have they're also, what's interesting about tropical shipping, it's an American company. It's owned by Saltchuk. Saltchuk owns Tote, which is the other big shipping company that serves Puerto Rico under the Jones Act. So Saltchuk owns Tote, and they also own tropical shipping. They use tropical shipping to serve the Virgin Islands, and the ships go down from Canada and they go down to Florida, and then they head over and they hit the Virgin Islands and a bunch of other small, a number of other islands. Then they head back and restart the loop, which means that it's more efficient because they're hitting more destinations. They can keep the ship full, because a lot of this is capacity utilization. Remember, Jones Act ships, they go to Puerto Rico and they're mostly full, and they go back mostly empty, or at least like, 2/3 empty. At least, a substantial portion of it is empty. So they lose. It's not as efficient, which they have to make up in cost. So it's not efficient utilization. So you can imagine you have like a triangle route where they go down to the San Juan, then maybe they hit the Dominican Republic, pick up some more cargo there, head back, so they can fill their keep their ships, capacity utilization is higher, which means more efficiency. So that's a few things I think are missing from the analysis. Also, you could envision larger ships hitting San Juan. Those ships on a per container basis are going to be cheaper. And again, it's the reason they would use bigger ships, because yes, they would hit San Juan, but they could also hit some bigger places along the way. Whereas in Jones Act world, Jones Act ships are not internationally competitive, so they're never going to go to an international destination along with hitting, San Juan. So it's a more efficient setup. I think I know that he underestimates the capital and some of the other costs in his calculations. So I think that's a big part of what's missing from his analysis.
I think Ponce is a good example of what you're talking about there, which is currently entirely underutilized as an international but also domestic port. It's not even operating in, maybe a fraction of a percent, but because of some of, storm damages and whatnot. But you open that up and it's, super Panamax capable, and you can have international ships coming in from the Pacific into Ponce, and then use that as a way station to head north into not only other Caribbean islands, but to the mainland United States.
Absolutely.
And
And
there's
also let's keep in
maritime
mind,
highways to San
yeah,
Juan.
that's a great point. And the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in 2012 mentioned in one of their reports, they said, look, shipping a container from the East Coast to San Juan was roughly a little over $3,000. And sending that same container to Dominican Republic or Jamaica was like $1,500 to $1,600, half the price. And Jones Act shipping has not gotten cheaper since. And that delta, there's no reason to think that delta is closed
No, in
since then.
fact,
So
it's
that's a
gotten
50%, delta right then. So yeah, I'm incredibly skeptical of McCown's analysis.
yeah, it's gotten worse since the pandemic, when
And
so much shipping got messed
yeah,
up. Yeah.
yeah, I recommend people take a look at some of the articles you've written, Colin, and analysis, even going back, almost 10 years, with regards, there's some charts in there that I've found that I think are really telling on what has actually happened with domestic shipbuilding and domestic crews, really since the 80s, in spite of laws supporting it. So I think that leads us to where do we go from here? Because one of the things that I mentioned at the top of our hours that we're going to be talking about, and we have talked about, we had this conversation with Ramon Luis Nieves about what does the next government in Puerto Rico really need to do to prioritize specific energy policies on the island, and thinking about from a policy perspective, how does Puerto Rico, how does the United States, Congress, how do we move beyond the current situation that it seems to have pretty obvious economic costs to it? We understand the costs in Puerto Rico, and you've helped us elucidate those. what's the argument for voting members in Congress? Right? Puerto Rico doesn't have um, voting representation there. How do we make sure that the people who do have voting capacity, why do they care?
Yeah, I can think of at least two reasons. So, one member of Congress who has taken on this issue to some extent is Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. He offered an amendment to a bill a couple years ago, maybe 3, 4 years ago, that would have exempted LNG shipments from the Jones Act. Of course, that'd be a win for Puerto Rico, but it's a win for Texas too. They'd love to export to their fellow Americans, and it's also an issue for New England, as well. So that's what there's a self-interested reason for some folks, certainly from energy producing regions. Also, Representative Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, he's proposed the same thing. I don't know, but I suspect that the fact that Pennsylvania has the Marcellus Shale play that may factor into his thinking that could be a win for the state there. But I think that the Puerto Rican, my understanding is there are more Puerto Ricans living in the mainland than there are Puerto Rico. That's a voting block that can be leveraged that, and I think has a voice and a lot of representation in Pennsylvania, some key swing states, a lot of representation in Florida. Um, and they can speak on Puerto Rico's behalf, and there are of course a number of members of Congress that have Puerto Rican heritage. AOC, Nydia Velasquez, Richie Torres, off the top of my head. These are people that are positioned to speak on Puerto Rico's behalf that do have voting power. And I will note that after was it the last hurricane that hit Puerto Rico, was it 2 years ago, that
Lorna.
8 members of Congress, something like that, that were all members of the Puerto Rican diaspora, called for a 1 year exemption of the Jones Act for Puerto Rico. So, and then Puerto Rico, I always think about the fact of how much cultural capital it has. Man, if Bad Bunny and Lin-Manuel Miranda and Jennifer Lopez all made the Jones Act a pet issue and raised awareness, part of me thinks sky's the limit on what can be accomplished. Because I think some of the stuff, when average Americans hear about this, they go, wait a minute, we're the world's biggest exporter of LNG. We can't send it to our fellow Americans who are also the one of the poorest parts of the United States. Puerto Rico is a state to be the poorest state by some distance, has a 40% poverty rate. We're jacking up. Force them to use some of the world's most expensive shipping. Just forget the economics. Like, where's the fairness? Where's the sense of justice in that?
Yeah, if
Yeah,
we,
but a few merchant marine unionists might be out of their jobs, and so they get all the other unions to make this a third rail, and the Democrats won't touch it. I mean, it's
Well, the
odd.
maddening thing, of course, Tom, is that strictly from the perspective of LNG, nobody loses their job. This is not a service they offer. There are literally nobody. There's 100%
agree.
upside, no downside. That's some of this other stuff. I go, okay, I at least get where you're coming from. This one is
So
it's deeply frustrating.
So
Yeah, yeah.
going back to the previous conversation, actually, before we talk about future policies, you made me think of something. Why is it not working, right? And why is it there? Why, I see obviously there's cost in building a U.S. flag tanker, but it sounds like there's a huge upside for it, right? Why is there not people filling that void and trying to figure out how to innovate a cheaper construction of a U.S. flag tanker to serve this wildly untapped LNG market?
Yeah. So, well, the GAO, Government Accountability Office, did a study back in 2015, I think, about basically, yeah, what would it take to build an LNG tanker in the US, and what would be involved in that kind of project? And they calculated at that time that a US built LNG tanker would be anywhere from like 400 million to $650 million. And back at that time, for comparison, a foreign built one was like 200 million, somewhere in that neighborhood. Well, today, then the Wall Street Journal had another article, I think in 2018, 2019, saying the U.S. built LNG tanker would be $700 million. They put the delta at over $500 million. The GAO study also said that if a U.S. shipyard were to build one, they'd probably have to bring over folks from South Korea to teach them how to do it, and do quality control on the whole thing. And it would take them 4 to 5 years to build. There's just zero business case for trying to jump in that industry or
Yeah.
build one. So it's never going to be built. It's just that.
Fine. I think there's I remember looking at some of this stuff for years, and there are maybe two places in the U.S. Capable
Yes.
of hosting and constructing something that large.
Yes.
Never mind, where you're rolling off the hulls for your aircraft carriers. I mean, I think it's actually one of them is one of those, and you're not going to interrupt the regular flow of hulls for aircraft carriers in order to build an LNG ship. Just not going to happen. So yeah,
That's a great point. Yeah, I know. I'm pretty confident that one of there were like, yeah, I think the GEO report said there's 2 or 3 shipyards that could do it. I'm pretty
yeah,
confident one of them is the NASCO shipyard in San Diego. They just got an order a few weeks ago from the Navy for like 8 more oilers at $840 a piece. That's going to keep them going for years. What's the point of them even trying to bid on a project like that?
right, right.
So looking forward, going back to the merchant marine element of the Merchant Marine Act, I look around, I look at the atlas, and seems like naval conflicts are at risk of springing up everywhere. Straits of Taiwan, Suez, Hormuz,
Yeah,
Aden, Red Sea, you name it, the Baltic Sea. There seems to be potential naval conflict or existing naval conflicts everywhere. What in Puerto Rico has strategic national security value. What role do you think the merchant marine has in any of these future conflicts?
Yeah, so the U.S. relies upon merchant mariners to crew U.S. sea lift ships. So the government, we talked earlier about the value of having commercial shipping that could be turned to in time of war. Um, but also the mariners themselves, the government does own its own ships, not as though it's 100% reliant on the commercial fleet. There are, government-owned sea lift ships, but they rely on U.S. mariners to serve on those. So I think there's value in that. But I gotta say, another place where this falls down is you mentioned the Taiwan Strait. I think if you were to place bets on U.S. involvement in a major conflict, the kind that would, demand a large sea lift response. I think that, the Taiwan scenario has got to be up there for potential ones. And well, the premise here is that, all the mariners show up and they sail, to wherever they're needed. But let's think about this. The US Navy a few years ago said they are not, no one should assume that any cargo ships will be provided with escorts across the Pacific in that kind of scenario, that they're not going to have the bandwidth, they're not going to have enough ships to do that. So, and remember, mariners, they're not members of the military. They're under no obligation to report. It's a purely voluntary thing. And a few weeks ago, there's an article about the Merchant Marine in which a guy named Sal Mercogliano, who's very pro Jones Act, he's a former merchant mariner. He said, I'm paraphrasing here, but something along the lines of, in that kind of scenario, how many guys are going to show up to report for duty when it's like you're going to sail across the Pacific unescorted, facing Chinese subs, facing Chinese missiles to save Taiwan? How many people are signing up for that? So I think a
they
lot of
won't
things
have
need to be,
choice is the answer, right? I mean, by
yeah.
presidential act, they're going to be impressed effectively into the Navy or an official thing, and they'll be made to serve because they've got the training and because they're Americans.
So, my response to this is instead of let's kind of pray that guys show up, we should form, a
Yeah,
merchant marine reserve, formalize it, make them members of the military, or have a program where they can serve through that, kind of like, a Navy reserve, and then give them the training. Because another thing is people like
yeah,
John Conrad, editor of G Captain, he's pointed out in an article saying, okay, let's say there was a war. I mean, I don't have training convoy tactics and radio protocol and stuff like this to interoperate with the Navy. I don't have the training for this. So I think this whole thing falls down just from a number of practical standpoints. And again, I'm not opposed to meeting these requirements. Absolutely, we should. Let's do it, and let's stop
yeah.
doing things that don't work, which, in my opinion, is the Jones Act.
So
let's not do it on the backs of largely Puerto Rico, right? And we've talked about all of these
Yes.
different things, and one of the important things that Alaska has, that Hawaii has, that the mainland states have is, and I'm not talking necessarily about the different workarounds. They have two senators, right? They're a state. If they're upset about something, if they want an LNG waiver, they just say, I'm not approving any more appointments to the military. I'm not going to move this to committee until I get what I want. Puerto Rico doesn't have that. And and
That's a great
and
point. Yeah.
maybe never will, right? We don't
And
know.
then also, yeah, also if this is truly all about national security, then we should pay for it nationally,
Yes,
all of
we
us.
should.
And we shouldn't make, I think Americans, the non-contiguous states and territories are like what, 2% of the population? And they're responsible. They utilize like at least half of the Jones Act fleet. So they're basically paying for, if this is a national security asset, they're paying for half of it. And not only they small percent, Puerto Ricans are the poorest part of the US. So we're sticking some of the poorest people with a huge
Yeah.
chunk of the bill. Again, just from a fairness perspective, none of this works.
No,
so is that
and it
what's
also
the
means
ultimate?
that the billions that you're putting in for energy, for rebuilding, etc., are far less effective than they should be. And so, if you think 14 billion is the right amount to put in to rebuild, why don't you double that? Why don't you triple it? Because of very simple things that you could do to change and open up the competition, allow investment to flow in to invest in production, for the United States, so that you don't have to worry about, well, if I'm producing bulk things, I can't sell them to the U.S. So that would be my natural market. Now I've got to find, people in South America. Well, the biggest market, biggest closest market is Venezuela. Good luck, right? So,
Well, and I think the, sorry, Tom, go ahead and finish your
oh
point.
no, I was just gonna remind that Braulio has been waiting very patiently to ask a few questions, and so I want to, I want to make sure that he gets in here before, I have to, open up another bottle of wine because it's like 1 o'clock here. But
No, that absolutely. But Aurelio, let me close on one more point and question to or two more questions to Colin. It's all yours. Um, the comment is that we have existing industrial policy that can be leveraged to support domestic production of ships. I guess the question is, um, what is the policy recommendation at the end of the day? Is it a full repeal of the Jones Act? Is it a fundamental redesign that creates strategic waivers and flexibility depending on specific goods and destinations? What's the policy recommendation at the end of all of this analysis?
Yeah, so I mean, look, if I'm king for the day, I'm setting policy. The ideal policy is, the first choice is we get rid of the Jones Act and we meet national security requirements through the use of targeted subsidies. For example, right now we have something called the Maritime Security Program, which provides $5.3 million per year to 60 cargo ships. These are all foreign-built U.S. flagged ships. They operate in international trade. Because of the Jones Act, they're prohibited from operating domestically in the country they are flagged in. And in exchange for that money, the U.S. gets the right to call on those ships and use them in time of war or national emergency. So I say we go to the Pentagon and say, guys, how many ships do you need? Is 60 the right number? You need more, and we pay for it. Let's do that. And that's how I would do it. Ideally, I think more realistically, more pragmatically, at the very least, can we just bring the Jones Act in line with all of our other cabotage laws, like airline cabotage, where you can use an airplane built wherever? There are no restrictions on that. That seems to be that would be a hugely beneficial step. And then ideally combine that with a waiver system. Can we just have it so that if I'm willing to use a US ship, but none exists. I want that LNG. I'll even pay for the American ship, but there are none. Then can I use a foreign ship? But we need to have a waiver system based on economic need for those situations. This isn't radical stuff. Mexico has a policy like that. Canada has a policy like that. Plenty of other countries have provisions for using foreign shipping if no domestic shipping is available. It's very common sense stuff. So I think those two things, just getting rid of the build requirement and allowing waivers for those situations where there isn't the fleet doesn't exist to support economic needs. I think that would be a really common sense place to land.
Even the
Colin, my last
bioenergy as included in like the IRA legislation and applied have carve outs exactly like that. And the manufacture of solar panels in particular, not available, right? I mean, more and more, hopefully, there's more investment going in, and that was the point. But in order to get the higher levels of ITC, especially for larger projects, I'm pretty sure that the guys doing the projects that just got the loan guarantee in Puerto Rico are probably hitting at least 40% on the ITC because of those provisions, because they can hire a certain amount, and if they can't hire, they can take advantage of that, and they can try to source, and if they can't source, they can get the extra 10%. Then it may even be up to 50. I don't know, probably. Yeah.
Colin, my final question is, where can people follow your work and keep up with your analysis?
Yeah, so my fellow Twitter/X addicts, you can follow me at CP Grabow, CPGRABOW. You can just Google me, find my stuff. I have a Cato page where it publishes all my latest stuff. And then also visit cato.org/Jones Act for just all Cato's Jones Act info. So yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, but don't use that quite as much. But yeah, lots of ways to hit me up and follow me.
Awesome. Colin, thank you so much for being a part of the Puerto Rico Energy Forum and joining us for Power Hour.
Sam, thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation. Tom, thanks to you as well. Lots of good comments, lots of good thoughts here.